On this episode, I welcome back to the show Kailee Carlson. Kailee is a registered acupuncturist. She's also a doctor of Chinese medicine, and she is a registered nurse. We talk about her transition from being a nurse in hospitals to transitioning to more holistic medicine with her acupuncture practice and her focus on Chinese medicine. And for those of you that are listeners of the podcast, you'll recognize her from a live episode that we did with her and Jacob Oak. Jacob is her partner, and I was excited to welcome Kailee back for a solo episode just to learn more about her, to highlight her expertise. And I really can't recommend this episode enough. I love that we fell into a very central theme, which is this idea of getting back to the basics and really understanding what works for you, focusing on key central components of your health and your wellness, managing stress from these places. The four basics, as described by Kailee, are movement, community, fueling with whole foods, and sleep. And so we want to focus on those four things before we layer in any other modalities, any other solutions, look for any other quote unquote magic pills or hacks. As we well know, those don't exist. And so Kailee and I expand on this. We talk about how these things have showed up in our own life, specifically the community perspective, how we've been able to leverage that and identify the value of community to help us do big endeavors on the endurance side, to help us build businesses. And Kailee's expertise, her vulnerability, her authenticity, her honesty go a long way in really allowing this conversation to unfold in what I feel like is a really meaningful way. And so I'm really excited for everyone to get access to Kailee on this one-on-one basis. Like I said, I was very happy to have her back on the show in this capacity so that we could highlight her and her personality and expertise. And so please sit down with this one from start to finish. I think there's a tremendous amount of takeaways for everyone, no matter where you're at. If you're coming to this podcast from the endurance space, from the coaching space, from the entrepreneurial and career development space, Kailee has a little bit of all that, and we touch on every piece. And I think there's a lot of pieces that are applicable here. So thanks as always. Please enjoy my conversation with Kailee Carlson. Hey, Kailee, welcome to the show. How are you?
Good. How are you?
So good. We had you on the show for those that are avid listeners and even maybe watchers of the YouTube channel. We had you and your partner Jacob live on the podcast a while back during the summer, and super excited to have you solo. We've had Jacob, who is your partner, solo on the show back last season, and really excited to have you solo now. It's been something that's been on my mind, and I just didn't do it for some reason. I just forgot to reach out. So our in-person session prompted me to do it. So I'm really excited to get some time one-on-one to learn more about you and give folks a chance to learn more about your expertise and your story. And I thought a good place to start would be your transition from, so you are a registered nurse. You worked in hospitals and have made the transition from working in that space to owning your own acupuncture clinic. You are a doctor of Chinese medicine. And I'm interested just to get your perspective and your story on that transition as it relates to, trends you were seeing, things that you experienced, and maybe how you felt like that transition would be more impactful, both for yourself as well as the folks that you are trying to help from a health perspective.
Yeah. So like you said, I went to nursing school in undergrad and started out working, doing all the clinicals in hospitals and everything. And was always intimidated by nursing for some reason and just like being in the acute care environment. But I knew I wanted to help people, and I knew I wanted something where I could work with anyone, travel, good job security, and that nursing provided all of that, and just making a difference. But then I worked in long-term care for a little bit in Hawaii. And then I was in Seattle for a few years, worked at a hospital out there, and worked on a neuro step-down unit. So it was a lot of strokes, brain surgeries, complex spine surgeries, just like very sick people. And jumping ahead a little bit, but looking back at what I know now, if those patients had been able to receive acupuncture and different modalities, like from Chinese medicine or just different holistic remedies, it's so like sad now because it's like they could have benefited so much from that, because acupuncture, this works on the neurological level. So those patients, if we could have gotten them this care immediately, it could have helped, honestly, like rewire their brains potentially. But anyways, that happened. And then I moved back to Minnesota, and I was working on an orthopedic and medical surgical floor. And that was a travel nurse assignment. And while I was working at this hospital, there were a few acupuncturists that worked inpatient. So they were working bedside with the patients. And I started talking to them and learning a bit more about how I could combine my background in Western medicine with doing more of the acute care side of things with something more holistic with Eastern medicine. And I had always known, even when I was in nursing school, that I wanted to pursue something around like nutrition, something more integrative and holistic, that wasn't just focused on pharmaceuticals, surgeries. And I didn't know exactly what that was, because even the registered dietitian world is still very heavily rooted in, not that acupuncture is not research and evidence like backed, but it was just still like the whole, like the FDA regulations, and just still didn't really fit what I wanted. And when I found acupuncture and Chinese medicine, I learned that I could be talking about movement practices and food therapy and lifestyle changes, and just really looking at the whole person. And what I had been part of what in the Western system was, you come in for a headache, and we're only going to look at your head. We're not going to ask like a ton of questions. We're just going to give you a painkiller to numb the pain, but we're not actually going to figure out like, why are you actually having this headache? And I'm a big believer in we need to look at the whole person, because we're not just a head. We're not just an ankle. We're a whole human being that has all these parts that all work together. And especially nowadays, even with like the mental health side of things, that all affects everything else. Like if you're super stressed out, you might have more headaches. So why would I just give you a painkiller when I could be addressing the root cause of that? And that's really what inspired me to get into this medicine, was more so looking at the root cause of things instead of just like the symptoms and the branches. And just something I've always been very passionate about with the preventative side of care. And I just didn't see the whole preventative side in the hospitals. I mean, from the food that we were feeding our patients, it was like, well, no wonder they're not getting better. I mean, people, if you look at the tube feedings and stuff that our patients are getting, like the first ingredient is high fructose corn syrup, and then it just goes from there. And it was just like flabbergasting to me to be like, how is this medicine? And not to put down MDs and stuff, because this isn't part of their training, but most of them that I've talked to either take 0 to 1 nutrition class. And again, I'm a big believer in food as medicine, like what you're putting into your body. That's your fuel. That's the fuel for your car, for your mind, for everything. And doctors just aren't learning that stuff. And that was always just, again, mind-boggling to me, when that's like one of the most important things to me. So that's kind of then what led me into this field, where people care about those things and what you're putting into your body, what you're putting into your mind, the community you're with, all of those things. So my long-winded answer to your question.
No, it's great. I appreciate you taking the time to unpack that, because I think, it brings up several several really important, I think they're important, points. And one of them is that everything is connected, right? Like the place that this shines the brightest or shows up the most for me and some of the work that I do, and I'm sure for you as well, is like when somebody has like a mobility issue, right? So for instance, like you and I are both runners, and you're an ultra distance runner, and I have, I am as well. And so like hip stuff, right? Like, oh, my hips are tight, or my knees are like a little tweaky or whatever. And then we just are like, people are like, okay, what's wrong with my knee? Or what's wrong with my hip? And I'm like, well, it's probably upstream or downstream. Like it's almost always because of some sort of imbalance elsewhere in your body that is just manifesting in that area. Like unless you actually like hurt your hip or hurt your knee or hurt whatever part of your body that we're talking about in terms of like you fell on it or you twisted it or whatever, like it's typically something else, right? It's a supportive like mechanism or mechanical thing. And it like, it's still that's just not how like we're wired to think in the Western world, right? Like my knee hurts, fix my knee. And like we should probably address like your posterior chain strength imbalances because of X, Y, and Z, or your like anterior tib is tight. And they're like, no, I'm just talking about my knee. And I'm like, but I'm right. And so there's this disconnect. What in your, I'd love to like unpack that more. Like what are some examples, or like how have you seen the like combination of those things, and not specifically with like mobility practices, but just with like, combining food and movement and all of these things that you work to bring into with your patients. Paint that picture for me. Like what does that look like when someone comes in versus like what are the outcomes that you see when we start to look at how we move through life in a more like combined fashion versus like all these silos?
Yeah. Well, for one, when people come in with like depression and anxiety, for example, I'm right away asking, how much sleep are you getting? Do you have a bedtime routine? Are you getting quality sleep? Do you get outside in the sunshine every day? Like, are you exposing yourself to the outdoors? How much time are you spending on your phone? Are you getting movement? And I think a lot of times people don't understand that even just the basics are so impactful. And again, like just from what I've personally seen, like in my own appointments with MDs, and just again, like what I saw in hospitals, is those things aren't being addressed. And it's so important. And then where acupuncture comes in is that's helping with the sympathetic nervous system. So again, it's helping with just making sure everything's flowing, calming down your nervous system so you can actually think clearly. But then when you combine it with all of these other like fundamental things, fueling your body with whole foods, that's where I see the big difference. And I know in our last podcast, we were talking too about people making things kind of overcomplicated, and how I try not to give like a ton of different take home things. Like I always try to send at least a few home with people, but really it just comes down to like those core things. And once you have all of those, then the body knows how to start responding and fixing itself. And I think that's something I'm very passionate about too, is letting the body heal itself. And we don't need to like flood it with all of these things like medications, prescriptions, whatever it is. Like when we give the body the tools it needs, it will fix itself. And sometimes we need a little extra help. And that's where acupuncture can come in, herbal medicine, things like that. Sometimes medications. Like this isn't me saying never go to your MD or never use medications or surgeries. It's just more of there's a time and a place for that. And if all those other things aren't working, then yes, then let's go back to some of these other modalities that we've developed in the last 100, 200 years.
I remembered that as well when I was like, oh, I think this is obviously a recurring theme that you and I are both passionate about, because as you were saying that, I was like, oh yeah, I think we talked about that when we did our in-person recording. But what are the basics? Like if we're like, okay, we want the body to heal itself. Let's not flood it with all these things. Let's not jump to some prescriptive component. What for you are the baseline things that we should focus on first before we integrate anything else? What are the boxes we need to check?
Yeah, so big believer in movement. If you're not moving your body during the day, things become stagnant. Your blood's not moving, your heart's not pumping, things aren't going into the brain. So that's like one of my number one recommendations. Move in any way that you want. Doesn't need to be running a marathon, just whatever you like. Two, surrounding yourself with like a community of like-minded people who make you a better person. That goes along the lines too of like, if you're putting a bunch of junk in your body, you're going to feel like junk. If you're surrounding yourself with people who make you feel bad, you're going to feel worse about yourself. And that goes to the mind. Like if you're in a good community, then you're going to want to move more, eat better, which then brings us to the whole foods and nutrition. What you're putting in your body is like, I can't stress it enough how important it is. If you go to McDonald's, you're probably not going to feel good about yourself after. Whereas if you're eating a salad or a soup or something that you made, something that you're actually cooking with your own hands too, that's going to literally like raise the vibration in your body. I'm not trying to sound woo-woo, but it actually has such an effect on your entire life. And then I would say sleep is the other huge one. And if you're not moving your body, if you're not eating well and exercising your brain, body during the day, maybe you won't be as tired at night. But if you're practicing all those other things, then ideally you're going to get quality sleep because you're just going to be tired. And I like to think back to like our ancestors and stuff a lot. And if you think about it, they were out on the farms all day. They were in sunshine. They were moving their bodies. They were eating foods that they had grown on their farms, just basic whole foods. Then at night, it would get dark and they would have no choice but to rest and then go to bed. So their circadian rhythms were not thrown off by our electronics, our blue light, our artificial lights. And they were tired because they had been working all day. And then they would wake up when, the roosters or the light would come out again, and then they would start their days. And again, I think we've just overcomplicated all of these things. And so it's like, just go back to those basics. And I am a believer that 90% of our illnesses and things that are going on, like all of the chronic diseases and things that we have, could be resolved just from that stuff. And maybe I'm naive in saying this, but just from what I've seen, like personally with myself and then with my patients and just research wise and things I've like looked into, that's what I've noticed and what I highly recommend for people.
Yeah. It reminds me of, and I'm sure you've probably seen it, was it the Blue Zones like documentary, right? And there was a book about that, and this guy did all this research and stuff, and I won't go down that rabbit hole, but I thought it was really interesting is that I when I talked to people about it, like before they watched it or read the information about it, they're like, oh, like I'm looking for like the secret hack, the magic like pill, the thing that I can eat that everybody eats that makes these people live for a long time. Like it's the secret to longevity. And of course he goes to all these different cultures and all these different places and different climates and different things. And the two things that were the staple and really the thing that seems to be the through line is consistent moderate movement and community, right? Like some of them ate pasta, right? And people are like, oh, well, it must be grains. Like we can't eat grain. They're like, no, it can't. It's not that. And then some of them ate meat and we're like, okay, well, it can't, right? Like it was all over the place and everybody was looking for, that's a broad stroke, but I think generally like we were like, okay, what's the thing? Like what's the shortcut that I can take, the thing and it was to your point, it was like, it's really the basics, right? And the big, massive through line was like shared meals with people that you care about, right? Like that, this community aspect of like taking time, slowing down, sharing meals, and then like moving through the day, right? Like they walked a lot, and they tend to walk in like terrain, right? Like up and down these little villages on different coastlines and different things. And I think that just really struck me to like piggyback off of your pointer to bolster it. Is just like, it's not some like superfood, right? Like it is just eating. It's eating like food that you feel like nourishes your body and tastes good and makes you happy with people that support you and move, right? And when you're done with that, go to sleep.
Right.
And like just sleep. And try your best, right? I'm interested in the like what role or how does the movement piece shift, if at all, in your experience, or how do we maybe shift our relationship with it when we really want to push ourselves, right? So like you're an ultra marathoner, you've run crazy distances. I've done this. I've always tried to push my body. So when you push your body, like it creates a lot of stress, right? And it makes you sore and tired, and you lose sleep. And so, what is like how you manage that in your own experience or with your patients? Like when the movement is not moderate by design, and there is intensity and duration and increased training stress, and we like those things. It's good to if I like to push myself, I know you do as well. So how do we like rectify that with like trying to be healthy, but there's kind of like an inherent, I don't want to say unhealthy, but like, like it's not natural to run 200 miles like you did. Like I've never done 200 miler, but I've done lots of other long, and I'm like, this isn't really what my body wants necessarily. Right. Like I'm aware that I'm at the edge of what's appropriate or even healthy. So what's that in? Yeah. Like how do you rectify that with an approach that's healthy or feels good or feels appropriate?
Yeah. I mean, I think you need to kind of weigh the pros and cons of what you're doing. Like you said, with running my 200, I mean, people looked at me like you're crazy and our bodies aren't meant to do that. And I'm fully aware of that. Like, I'm not here to say, oh, everyone should be running 200 miles and it's, there's so much benefit to your body. But in my mind, it's more of the leading up to the race and coming off the race, like the come down. And that's like the most important for how you're training and then how you're recovering. And I'm not going to go out and do a 200 every month or every week. And I've seen people that have done, hundreds back to back. And a lot of times, not all the time, but it will lead to injury, sickness, burnout, things like that. So I'm more of a fan of doing one big race a year, like max. I'll still do, I'm doing a 10 miler coming up here, balancing it out. But if you're trained enough and doing that like moderate, consistent training for a long time leading up, then ideally your body will be more ready for a crazy thing like that. And it's getting the mind ready too. If you're not mentally prepared for those things, that can take you out. And I worked with Christine Hernandez, part of your team, and she was extremely influential in getting my mind ready for these things and then learning how to come off of it. Again, I'm a big advocate in recovery for things. So I think if you're going to do big efforts, you need to have some kind of rest and recovery period after where you can just calm everything. So I immediately went to acupuncture after my 200 for the physical side and the mental side of things. I was getting massages. I was still eating super well. And I think with the nutrition part too, I see with a lot of athletes that they're like, oh, I'm, going out for a 20 miler today. So therefore I can eat Pop-Tarts and popcorn and whatever I want. And in my mind, I'm like, that's the time when you should be even eating even better, because then you're breaking down your body, and then it needs to be fueled with something to recover afterwards. So coming off of big races and stuff too, that's something that I'm very passionate about. And again, it's not about doing 100% all the time. That's not what I'm saying either. It's just using all of the tools you've learned over the years to be able to get you to those big efforts and then be able to come off of them as well. Is that kind of Christian?
Yeah, what I know a bit of the kind of backstory with your build up to your 200. So I'm what's the mental aspect like for me? I've often felt I still feel this way. That like the pursuit of these things that are out of our reach at the onset, right? Like right now, I can't do X, and so I'm going to set a goal and I'm going to build towards that thing. And that's a stretch goal, and the possibility for failure is high. The pursuit of that thing really, and the value intrinsically that it has, is over and above any like fitness component, right? Like I always say, like fitness is a really cool byproduct of doing these things, because the benefit that I recognize and I'm most passionate about, honestly, is like the commitment to that thing, like the mental component, and what it kind of pushes me to do from be it from like an athletic identity perspective, be it from like a discipline perspective, be it like the list goes on. And then en route to like solving all those kind of things and getting like, I am also getting more fit, and that's cool. Like it's nice to be fit, but I always see that as like a secondary or even like tertiary component of this. So I know behind the scenes when you were training for your 200, like you were also starting a business, your acupuncture practice. And I know what it takes to start businesses. I also know what it takes to train for long distance races. And I'm like, holy shit, that's a lot. And so, and you did it, both successfully. And so I'm curious, like, what was your, outside of just like the execution on the physical side, which is important, what were some of the mental practices before and after that you leveraged, or like how you utilized discipline to make sure that the pursuit of that thing was actually valuable, right? Because the other way that could have gone is it could have just burned you out. You could have just been miserable and tired and gotten through it and been like, screw this, like this, right? Like, and I think that happened. I mean, I see that happen a lot with athletes or with just people in general. There's too much going on and they just shut down because they're not finding any real intrinsic value. It's all externally, outcome based. And so it just starts to lose its luster. What was that mental piece for you, or if that's not the appropriate words that you would use to describe it, I'm interested to like hear your perspective on everything outside of the physical.
Well, like speaking of business and fitness, I think part of the reason why I love ultras and doing these distance events is because I learned so much that's directly applicable to my business and to entrepreneurship. All of the practices that I learned with Christine and with mindset things, now that helped me to start my business, because I started to believe in myself and believe that I was, meant in these places that I never thought I was before. I, have been running since high school, but was always one of the slower ones. And I've never owned my business ever, but I was always an extremely hard worker. And I think just, again, doing things like repeatedly for a long time, like these are not things that happen overnight. And I think sometimes people get into their heads like, oh, you just like went out and ran a 200 miler, or, oh, you just went and like started your own business. And it's like, no, these are things I've been working on for my entire life, basically. And it takes a lot of hard work. And then I think it was just the 200 that was just a byproduct of all of that hard work. And the business was a byproduct of having all these connections that I built over the years and going to lots of school. And the mindset piece, like I mentioned, I had to do a lot of work in believing in myself. And again, like believing that I belonged. That was like a huge thing for me. And I'm big into mantras and stuff as well. And those are things that I use throughout all of my races. And that's something Christine like has helped me develop, and things that like are meaningful to you. I mean, things that like my mantras might be completely different than yours, or my mindset practices might be completely different. So I think it's a very individualized thing as well. But I listen to a lot of podcasts, and everything that I'm putting in my mind and what I'm surrounding myself with, especially leading up to races, I am extremely careful on who I'm spending my time with, what kind of music I'm listening to, what kind of podcasts I'm listening to, what kind of shows I'm listening to. I only want people that are hardworking. Positive is kind of a hard word to throw around because I don't want only positivity, but just like people that are like willing to work hard, I guess is what I'm doing. And like people that are going to be uplifting to me. And that helps to change my mind. Like, I don't want people who are bringing my vibration down, because then that will make all of these other races and work that much harder. Lots of journaling, things like that, and talking to people who have done these things before me. And again, these are all, once you then hit these milestones, then the ceiling just starts to lower more. And then then I try to reach then for the next thing. And it's another thing I work on, is to not immediately then go for the next one, and to try to sit in your accomplishments as well. So I do believe that's a huge part like of the mindset thing too. But just, it makes, once you hit these things, it makes everything else feel achievable or more achievable.
I love that. I think it brings up something that I've talked about a lot, and it's something I've recognized more and more as I go through life, specifically with athleticism, but with anything, certainly in the business and entrepreneurial space. But it's like the value of the support and really like buy-in from the people around you, right? Like, it really does take a village. And when I tell people, like when I'm talking to athletes, I say this all the time. I'm like, before you set this goal, like, you got to get everyone around you on board, because it's not just about you, right? Like, you have to have everything from just the kind of actionable, like tactical piece, like, how do you balance training with your life, right? Like, how does that get scheduled in? If you have a partner that you have, shared responsibility, there's lots of moving parts in life. And so if you got to get a long run in or a long ride or whatever you're doing, like, when does that happen, right? Like, who takes the load when you're not available? And, so there's some very real like life conversations, but also just that like belief and support, right? And being around people that recognize the value of that thing and aren't bringing you down. And that's something that I've really focused on in the last several years. It's like, I'm not interested in being around anybody who is like, who's playing small, right? So if I tell somebody something, I'm like, I have this idea, or I'm going to do this. And they're like, oh man, like, you're working too much and you're just doing, like, no, like, I don't want that energy around me, right? Like, now I'm certainly okay to be checked, right? If there's feedback, I'm open to that. But I want to be around people that are excited to push and excited to, understand what's next and what haven't they accomplished. And I think that's just such an underappreciated, or even like kind of we don't talk about it enough, like the value of that thing, right? Like the value of really having that like shared buy-in. And I guess it really takes us back to community too. But I think I always advocate for like identifying who those people are. And it sounds like you do the same thing. It's like, then like be in those people's circles as much as possible. Right. And we talk about when I'm doing leadership development work, we talk about the ripple of influence and like how you allocate your time and like how you think about where that energy is like flowing back to you versus where you're just pouring out. Right. And so like you start with like, we call it your 3. And it's literally like the three people where you get just as much support in like coming back to you that you get coming out, right? So I call them like your ride or die, right? That's the people that like you call in the middle of the night, no questions asked, like those are your folks. And then as you get further away from that center, you get a few more people, right? Then it's like 12 people and 48 people, and those numbers can vary. But I think it's really helpful to identify like who those people are and spend more time with them, right? Because I think we spend a lot of time on the periphery and feel beat down and feel kind of pulled in lots of different directions. And the fact of the matter is like those people probably just aren't people we should be taking advice from, right? They're just not our core people. Like, do you get that specific with it, or like in your own way? Like, it sounds like you're very methodical and very focused on like who gets that time. Is that like a practice of yours, just something you found valuable from like a community curation perspective?
Yeah, I think it's definitely just something I've developed over the years, and just finding, because I've also realized like it can change at any time too. I mean, those three people, like you said, it doesn't need to be that for forever. And I found that as I go through seasons in life, and even when I'm training for different things, when I was training for the 200, my crew or team was maybe different than now with training for more of like a road run. And I think we need to understand too that there's, like I said, there's different seasons, there's different times for everything. We're going to be changing as people. And if I'm more focused on my business, then I'll have my business people that I can talk to and those mentors. But at the end of the day, I mean, I think it's just more about just finding good humans to surround yourself with. And once you start doing that, in my mind, it just becomes that much easier. But I do think for a lot of people taking that first step, whether it's, you have your crew from college or whatever it is, and realizing like, okay, we're going different in different directions, and that's okay. And just being able to be flexible with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think the seasonality of that is really important. Like we all tend to get, stuck, right? We're like, this is it. Like there is a time and a place, and you have to be adaptable. I want to go back, or I want to lean more into the like how endurance sports, like how fitness impacts and informs like business and entrepreneurship, because that is something that I could talk about that forever. And literally, it's like why this podcast exists. Like there is for me, been such a clear through line of like, when I do this, it creates clarity. Like I can't do them separately, right? Like it informs so much of like who I am and how I show up and how I think about my career and how I'm able to do that thing. So like, what is that? I just want to like lean into that more. Like, what does that look like for you? Like, what are some direct like through lines? I know you talked about like confidence and seeing yourself as like belonging, but now that you're off and running and you have your practice and like that thing's moving, like how does that continue to inform or support the business and entrepreneurial side with the fitness and endurance side of things?
Well, for one, I've learned how to be uncomfortable all the time. Like when you're running,
Mm-hmm.
you're
Totally
very uncomfortable and it hurts a lot. It's not easy. And I've learned that with the business world too. Being now a solo business owner, it's hard a lot. I mean, it's not easy. And I think we can glorify it as, oh, you get to set your own schedule, you get to be your own boss, you get to do everything yourself. But with that comes a lot of responsibility. And I think the cool thing is I've learned that like that running is the same thing. I am the only one who can get myself across that finish line. Yes, I can have the best crew and best and most supportive crew in the world who's, they've all done tons of ultras and stuff before. I have the best food, but at the end of the day, they're not the ones carrying me across the line. Like it's myself. And same with a business. I can have a great set of mentorship. I can have all the money in the world. And at the end of the day, if I'm not a good leader and a good business owner, my business isn't going to be successful. So I think that's one of the big parallels that I've seen. And just knowing that some days are going to feel great. I might have an influx of new patients. I might have really good outcomes with the treatments that I'm giving. Just like I might have really smooth days of running and a good like training block. And then other times you're like, wow, I'm terrible. Nobody's going to want to come back and see me. And it just feels really, really hard sometimes. And you just question yourself, like, why am I doing this? Like, I don't need to be. I could go back and be working as a nurse right now, again, with a good, solid income, good benefits. It's respected. But I choose to put myself in that uncomfortable position day after day. And just like with moving my body and doing strength training, running, all of those things.
I love that. I couldn't agree more. And I've heard entrepreneurship in particular or specifically described as like the ability to continue to do something without visible results for longer than anyone else could put up with it. Right. Like this, like, and I think that's, to your point, like that's very much how I see the endeavor of like, of fitness, specifically like lifelong sustainable connection to like a consistent movement practice, like making this a part of your life and knowing that like for me there's no end goal, right? Like it will be punctuated by races or goals that I have, but I'm not going to stop, right? And so I show up tomorrow and I do the same thing, right? Or I push myself in some different way, or I do, and I'm not going to see any results from that, right? I am no more fitter because of the workout I did this morning than I was yesterday. It is the cumulative effort over much longer periods of time than we truthfully would care to admit, right? Like that ultimately lead to success. And it's the same thing with business, right? It's just this like what I did today probably doesn't really move the needle, right? It's what I do this month or this quarter or this year. It's stacked over years and years. I also love the analogy, and I don't think that I've like maybe even put that final point on it, but it's in terms of like enjoying the good days, right? Like you have with training, in my experience, right, there's like a handful of days a season where you're like it clicks, and then every other day, like you don't necessarily feel like shit, but you just do it, right? Because you've said you're going to do it, and you develop the discipline to show up, and that's what it takes to move the needle, and so you do it. And it's the same thing with business, right? It's the same thing with entrepreneurship. Is like, you have those like high point days, and those are great, but realistically, right? Like they're probably few and far between. Certainly like the big wins, the big like milestones, the big, one of the things that I'm horrible at is celebrating those wins. So I know this about myself. I'm working on it, but, it's important, right? Like, but also like not to put too much emphasis on it so that when it doesn't happen again, like you're not destroyed, right? Like if you don't tomorrow feel the same way about training, you're not going to be like, well, screw this, I'm out. And I think it's the same with work. So what's your, like, how do you celebrate? Like, how do you make sure that those milestones that they're represented appropriately, you enjoy them, but also are able to like get back to work, so to speak? What's your approach there? I feel like you're better at this. I just have a feeling you're better at this than I am. So I want, this is a personal, this is for me, if nothing else.
I don't know. I feel like not great because I feel like my whole life I have constantly just strived for more and to be better and to hit the next accomplishment. And again, back to Christine, like she is very, okay, after the 200, what are you going to do to like celebrate yourself after this? No matter if it goes good, bad, whatever happens, like what are you going to do? And so I am very trying to like work on these things. And I think for me, it's celebrating with the people around me. So my partner Jacob has been great in being like, Kaylee, like that's a huge accomplishment. Like whether it's, hitting the amount of patients that I wanted for the week, hitting my record amount of patients and being like I think it's perspective too, looking back and being like, wow, I remember when I had 2 patients in a week and was so excited for that, or 2 patients in a month. And that was a huge thing. And now I've hit this, and I do like, it's important to be proud of yourself and to recognize like how far you've come. And then I like to also look back at like all of the work that I've done to get to that point. But yeah, I think we can all spend, like, especially as entrepreneurs and people who are always trying to achieve things, to sit back a little bit and be like, wow, great job, Taylor, or great job, Kaylee. Like, you worked really hard for that. Because I don't ever see it as an issue for particular you or I to be like, well, hit that goal. Like, now I'm good. Like, now I'm going to step back. Because like you said, there's never really an end goal. And I feel the same way. With my 200, people are like, what's next? And while I still don't know what that exact big next thing is, I knew that that wouldn't be my last thing ever. And Jacob and I talk about with our businesses. I mean, yes, I have, this business, Dr. Kailee Acupuncture now, but that could morph into something completely different in the next 10 years. It's not this whole, well, once I get to this many patients a week or this, gross income, then I'll be good. I feel like you keep just expanding that and raising the bar more and more. So that's why I'm not concerned about okay, I'm good in hitting that like end goal.
Mm-hmm. How do you balance that? And maybe balance isn't the right word. But with, I'll speak for myself, like with that mentality, which to your point, like, I don't see that as a bad thing. Like, I think that there are like, for me personally, there are, some like guardrails that I need to put on myself to make sure that that comes from a healthy place. Cause I've been in a place where that wasn't healthy and it actually impacted like my health and relationships and so on. But there also, I think seems to be an inherent level of stress or discomfort or both with that general kind of like pursuit in life, right? Because there's a certain level of like unrest there. That there is like a relentless quality to that. And that is, again, I don't think that's a bad thing, but I also recognize that I think my baseline, again, this is for me personally, like my baseline is probably more like stressful than most people care to put up with. And so my question is, or like how do you, one is like, does that resonate with you at all? Or, is that just a me thing, which I'm perfectly able to accept? And then if so, like, how do you manage that with like what your beliefs and practices, like with your health? Like, how do those things go hand in hand? This like drive and pursuit and maybe an increased level of stress with like also wanting to take care of yourself and be present and be mindful about how your body and mind like exist in the world. How do those things like interplay with for you?
Definitely not just you. Definitely feel the same.
That makes me feel better.
Maybe just us two, but at least there's 2 of us. But
I've talked to lots of other. Yeah, I think it's a relatively. Yeah, we're not alone, Kailee. I think there's others.
We're not alone. But yeah, I mean, with being fitness people and business owners, we know that there's always going to be work to be done. I could be working on, my website or marketing or different things all the time. And like you said, like it is very hard to like put the mind at ease because you know that you have the tools and the capability to keep pursuing whatever you want and to keep growing in order to hit these goals. But also you do need to pull back, I think, sometimes. And that's where I feel like my recovery practices come in. Things like acupuncture, going for a walk, spending time with family, cooking a good meal. And it's hard because I feel like my mind never turns off from all the things that I can be doing. And I think that's something I've always tried to do. But I think also I'm not wired like that. And I know you and I talked about this too, about how we're not the people to just sit on the couch and watch Netflix and turn off the mind for a while. That makes me more anxious to do that. Whereas if I was, clicking off my task list or cleaning or whatever it is, that's how I can rest and kind of take the time away from always pursuing the next thing. And again, I think everyone's different with that. But even for me, going into the outdoors and camping or being by water, like that's when I notice my mind like truly slowing down. And I'll still get business ideas and stuff that will pop into my head, but then I'll immediately put it into my notes app on my phone and be like, okay, now I don't need to think about that for a little while because I already wrote it down. I'm good, can set it aside. And yeah, I think just realizing like we're never truly going to be off. Like that's the nature of our personalities and just kind of what we signed up for with fitness and entrepreneurship.
Totally. Yeah, that's great. I mean, I appreciate you saying that in the sense that I just think it's, for myself and for others, listening, there can be kind of an inherent, I think, just like push and pull with this like pressure of what we think we should be doing and what we maybe see others doing versus like what feels appropriate for us. And I think it's different for everyone. Like, I think rest, I think if there's, maybe if there's like no other takeaway from this episode, and there are many great ones, but it is like, understand like what that is for you, right? Like it took me a long time to recognize that like sitting on the couch didn't make me feel better, right? Like there are other ways for me to rest and to shift my thoughts and my mind to be in some version of relaxation that is not like hanging out watching a movie. Like I doesn't, I could do that maybe once a year. And otherwise, like you said, it makes me feel anxious. I'm like, I don't like this feeling. I don't want to sit here. And I think we have to find what that is for us and lean in and know that, like, especially with how pervasive it is to get other people's inputs, right? Like other people's approaches via social media and the internet, right? Like you type in anything and you can think you're doing it wrong, right? They're going to be like, oh, like do this and not that. So like find your lane, right? Like do your thing and like lean in and be confident in that and work to like do it well. I love that. Any like final takeaways? Like if you want somebody to walk away with one thing from our conversation, what would that be?
I think at the end of the day, just do what feels best to you and really just listening to your body. And like you said, not like it's okay to take all these like different voices and opinions, but if you really don't know where to begin with your health, like going back to the basics, like I talked about, sleep, movement, your community, and food, and just really focusing on those things. And then everything else is just an extra and the cherry on top.
I love that. That's perfect. Thanks, Kailee. We appreciate you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's been fun.
Agreed.